one, we will be crossing into registering about 100,000 if we do not address some of the emerging issues, and it's very expensive to treat. That's how bad it is. Next. Yes, I know the topic was, but we'll talk about tourism later, but COVID has greatly affected our performance in terms of tourism. I will share the statistics later. It has led to a decline in funding. It has impacted on our anti-poaching and the related surveillance efforts. It has led to some observed increase in poaching because of the various factors that I will share, and the communities are also feeling the pinch and the impact because of the benefits that used to accrue from tourism. And we know that lack of benefits to the communities will influence and push these guys to impact or interface with wildlife in one way or the other. Next. Yes, the marked decline in the number of visitors from over 320,000 visitors in 2019 to 72 during the same period. If you compare, that has also had a corresponding decline in revenue, as we will see, and every month when we were under the lockdown, as Uganda, we are losing about $130 million, and about 20 trips were cancelled or postponed during the lockdown and some of the other measures that had been undertaken by government, or that I'm now speaking for, was and could still be losing an estimated $2.7 million per month. That is more than, I think, 7 billion per month. That's how bad it is. And I will give you an example that between July to November 2020, we were collected 2.6 billion shillings compared to 52 billion shillings during the same period in 2019. That is a very, very small and significant impact on us. And when you have no revenue, then, like I said, no surveillance, the patrols are badly hit, the allowances are hit, the wages, and we need money to maintain the infrastructure, including the trails and the roads. And that is how COVID has had an impact on us. In 2019, we were performing very well, like I said, and when we had the outbreak of COVID, we reviewed our targets to what you're seeing in red, what we call the COVID targets in terms of visitor performance. But between January and September, I wasn't able to access the data between October and November, December, because we're still compiling from the field for this very quarter. But you can see what we had set as targets, the COVID targets, and what we have been able to achieve. Out of the 200 that we had set to receive, we only have 72. And that's quite sad for us that we're able to have a decline to that extent. This is a comparison, and members will note that we're comparing 2019 and 2020. You will note that the red line is 2020, and by January and February, we were performing very well. This was a promising year. But as we moved along with the outbreak of the deadly disease, you can see a very sharp decline in terms of visitor performance and arrivals. And I should say, in April, we actually had 0. And May, we had about, I think, 30 or 25 who were, I think, within the country. And we are trying now to gain a takeoff, but you can see the graph or the line is still relatively flat. So that isn't good for us as a sector. Yes, again, trying to compare here 2019 and 2020 using this graph, you can see that April, May, June, they are not good months for us, but they are trying to pick up again. I think we can share this later. But January, February had done very well. In terms of protected area performance, we again see Queen Elizabeth and Murchison Falls at least continue to receive some visitors in January, in 2020, between January and September. We still got some visitors, but you can see again, the parks are not doing very, very well. Mugainga, that used to do very well. Kiva also has been doing very well, but you can see the figures aren't good. The graph isn't giving us a positive trend. Next. Yes, and this is the impact on law enforcement. And mainly here we focus on poaching. You realize that in 2019, which is blue, we had somehow contained, but in 2020, the red, especially around the April again, and May, June, you see a spike or an increase in terms of poaching. I tried to do some two comparisons here. You can see that there's a sharp increase in terms of poaching. These are the cases we were registering. Next. And you have the figures here that in 2019, where we had about 495, we registered 761 cases, and the suspects again increased from 800 to 1,300 because of the COVID effects and the minimal, the lockdown and the restrictions caused by the lockdown. Next. Yes, and this shows some of the tools that have been confiscated and some of the items that we were confiscating during the period. And you can see that there is also a significant increase in the number of items or tools that were impounded from poachers and the related criminals during the 2019 and then compared to 2020. And among them, the key ones are the fishing nets. You see 370. We have the fishing hooks and the wire snares, the last one on the bottom of the table. We have over 850 wire snares. And that's what has driven us to somehow conclude that these are majorly subsistence hunters or poachers, guys who lay snares. They are not doing commercial poaching. And that's how somehow we think that people were looking for food because of the lockdown. But again, you see the first one, you have a few guns also captured or confiscated from the poachers, about 6 of them. These could be commercial poachers as well, but also subsistence. But we needed to do further investigations to ascertain the cause. But that's quite high, the 6 guns. Next. Yes, here we have also other observations that we've had some reported encroachment around some of the protected areas. We've also had some illegal logging and fishing. I talked about fishing earlier, but also we need to really appreciate the importance of tourism, where the studies have revealed that where you have tourism, then there is constant surveillance and there is minimal poaching. And this has been observed around Bindi, around Chibare, and even in Queen Elizabeth, where you have regular game drives, then the poachers tend to avoid those areas. Now, in the absence of tourism due to COVID, we've also had poaching in the tourism zones. Then we had this as something unique, that once you arrest some of the suspects, in order to minimize the interaction between the individuals and ensuring social distancing, the police and the other security agencies were releasing some of our poachers on bond. And some of them have since jumped bail and disappeared. We can't trace some of them, yes. Next. Yes, the other second one was to share with you the impacts on community conservation. Now we've also, because we largely depend on tourism revenue, we've seen a decrease in the revenue and the jobs. People have been able to lay off staff. We have several hotels and lodges in and around the protected areas. And because these guys have lost back to interface with the animals and they kill some. So people have lost jobs. The market for local products, those of you who had visited places like Bwindi, like Chiware, like Makshoni, Queen, they were emerging shops, local shops for products such as crafts and related merchandise, but there's nobody to buy these. And then Uganda Wildlife Authority under the new act and the old act actually, we are required to share 20%, sorry for that, that's 2%. We are required to share 20% of our park entrance fees with the local communities. Between 2005 and 2019, we shared 35 billion. But under COVID, we do not have the money to share. And that will cause negative feelings, negative perception that will influence the thinking of the people. Of course, with awareness, we'll be able to address this. We don't know how much we'll be able to generate to share with the communities. Supervision of the community conservation programs, the outbreak and the subsequent lockdown, we were not allowed to organize meetings, mobilize and sensitize the communities. So because of the restrictions on travel, so that has also affected the regular or routine work with the communities, and also the need to ensure social distancing, the regulated number of people that are required to be in a meeting, that has affected the community conservation programs. Now, under also the Wildlife Act, Section 35F, we are allowed to share regulated resources with the communities: bamboo, reeds, fish, water, a few selected resources. When we had the lockdown and the implementation of the standard operating procedures, we were able to restrict access to some of these resources. And that causes bad feelings, that causes some negative feelings amongst our people, that we are not allowing them, yet they can't work and they can't access some of these resources. And that may also increase the demand for food, and people will end up poaching. Next. The declining revenue from wildlife utilization, and here I must pull out or point out that we undertake what we call regulated trophy hunting, targeting old, mature bulls or animals such as zebras, buffaloes, and so on. And this helps us to generate money that is re-injected into conservation. But over 70% of this money that we generate from trophy hunting is given to the communities and the local governments to make them feel the benefits and support the conservation. Now, that's the amount of money we have shared before, over $2 million, about Uganda shillings, 8.9 billion shillings during that period. But under COVID, we can't know whether, because there are no visitors coming in to participate in this lucrative and very exciting activity, we also had an impact on disease monitoring because the focus was on COVID, using the money we had budgeted for to trace or focus on monitoring other zoonotic diseases. But with the focus on COVID, this has affected our budgetary allocations. This could also be a problem. Some of the diseases could impact on the livelihoods of the people. Diseases such as anthrax, polio, and so on. Some of the staff and family members have been affected by COVID, and this has affected their performance to be able to interface fully with the communities. Maybe I should point out that the person speaking is one of the victims who lost a mother because of COVID, and that I had to take off a few days, over 14 to isolate, and I wasn't working. So that is how bad it was, that as I speak, I was one of the affected members of staff. And because of the need to ensure social distancing and minimize on interface between the staff and the potential for spreading the disease, we were able to scale down on attendance at the head office and some of the other sites, and that affected also our performance, and then the visits to the different stakeholders. Yes, this poaching we're talking about, if we do not contain it, if we do not address the poaching, what happens? We would lose some of the precious, like it has happened before with our eastern black rhinos and the northern white rhinos. They all went extinct because of poaching. The snares have been observed to impact on some of the species, especially those that live in the trees, like chimpanzees and the other species. They can't branch yet, they can't look for food. You can see one picture on the right, that's a chimpanzee with a wire snare, and it is almost cutting off the palm or the hand. So that's how bad it is. We've seen poaching lead to a decline in both the plants and animals, the populations. For example, we had over 30,000 elephants in 1960. Currently, we have about 6,000 only, and the other species also. But although we are registering an increase, but this poaching impacted on us in the 70s and the 80s. Poaching displaces some of the animals, and the animals are forced to change their routes, and some of them have ended up on community land, where we also currently experience increased human-wildlife conflict, the disruption in the breeding patterns, the disruption in natural migration, and then the conflicts that we're observing today. Yes, tourism, I've talked about it, and loss of revenue, that is poaching. If people can't see the animals, they will not pay you to go into the parks, but also the communities that live and survive because of the animals and the tourism that comes along with it, the market for their products. That's how bad it is if we lose the animals, the potential for transmission of diseases, but also we need to mitigate against this because it impacts on the image of the country as Uganda. If we do not have the animals and we can't control our poaching levels, then we have that negative reputation internationally. Next. Now, what are we doing? Colleagues and participants, we haven't been sleeping. We've done some bit of work. When we realized that it wasn't going to be easy and we didn't have the funding from tourism, we developed what we currently call the contingency plan. We looked at our resources and we were able to distribute and prioritize. And the focus mainly was on resource protection, that is anti-poaching or law enforcement, and we wanted to protect the people. So we had to allocate resources towards mitigation of human-wildlife conflicts. Now, we have also we have formulated standard operating procedures, mainly for staff and for regulating tourist activities, research as we are developing, and we have also a draft SOPs for accessing the resources I talked about earlier. We've also been in touch with some of our friends, donors, and partners to provide the support. We're in touch with the central government. You know, UA is a government entity, but we also have the central government where we subscribe to. We are under the ministry, so we have submitted a request to be supported. We have also been able to strengthen our collaboration with other agencies, URA, police. We recently observed that some people were harvesting the resources illegally and going through posta. Uganda, we've brought them on board as partners. We are also having training sessions for our staff, and mainly focusing on intelligence and investigation as well as enforcement. We've recently, about a week ago, imported in, working with our partners at the Wildlife Conservation Society, imported in additional sniffer dogs to help us control the exit and entry points into the country. And then we think we can fight off this poaching, the reported poaching, using our community informants and using what we call a community intelligence. We have our people there. And we've also intensified awareness and education on radios and television. And then we are also going into using the modern technology. We have our cameras, and other equipment. So I should make a correction that the sniffer dogs were a donation and supported by the African Wildlife Foundation. That's a correction I'd like to make. Thank you. Now, way forward, we needed to, I brought in this slide, this is the official extract from the Ministry of Health website. Wash your hands, cover your nose, and do not sneeze, please. And then ensure that we have the social distancing and avoid contact with anyone with any cold or flu. And then do not eat the wild animals. Do not get in touch or eat wild meat, but also the livestock meat or beef or any other animal should be properly cooked. Next. This slide almost done, that we will continue to strengthen our intelligence and enforcement. We will continue to educate the people through aggressive and awareness and education. We will continue to, where applicable, share the benefits, the little benefits that we get as we improve with our performance. We will share with communities and stakeholders, that we will continue to recognize the importance and the role local communities can play in gathering intelligence information, but also helping us to apprehend some of the criminals. We will continue to identify alternative livelihood options for the people so that they do not look at wildlife as the only source of livelihood. We will also, we have learned the hard way, we will continue to think hard and identify other alternative revenue streams for supporting the sector, wildlife conservation. We will also work, we are hoping, we have several projects lined up for implementation. We would like to make sure that we improve on habitat protection, but also the connectivity so that animals have wide-ranging areas so that they don't conflict with the people. We know that some people conflict with the wildlife because animals have crossed over to their private property or land. So we'll continue to address the conflicts, and then where appropriate, where we can, we will promote virtual wildlife tourism. You are here in Kampala, but you are seeing gorillas in Bwindi. You are here in Kampala, you are seeing giraffes in Kidepo. We will explore that option, but we also want to continue ensuring that we have a routine surveillance so that we can swiftly respond to some of the reported cases of poaching and conflicts. And then we will continue to write grants so that we can receive support, but also we will continue to allocate resources and ensure that we have reserves in the long term so that we can support conservation. And then we are eagerly waiting, we are patiently waiting for the reported vaccines. Some countries have already started. We will address the affordability issues when the time comes. But we are told around May, we will have the vaccines. I read it in the press yesterday. So the important thing is to ensure that you protect yourself, and by May you will be vaccinated. Next. Yes, the conclusion. In conclusion, we must recognize that COVID is a real threat. And like I said earlier, there is a new strain that I would call it a subspecies in wildlife terms that has emerged. So we will continue to recognize that COVID is a threat, and the negative impacts on tourism have really also trickled down to affect the other sectors, including law enforcement and community conservation. We need to attend to the health of the people, but also the health of the wildlife, since we've known that COVID does not only affect people, but also some wildlife species, as reported in the various journals. And then we still think that if our wildlife is protected, we know wildlife-based tourism remains our viable option, and in the long term, we will be able to harness the benefits. We need to minimize pressure on the habitats and ensure enhanced coordination with all the other sectors and partners. And here I appeal to all of you listening that we welcome you to work with us to be able to protect our heritage, our wildlife resources, and we need to establish some sustainable funding mechanism so that in case of any future outbreak, we are well cushioned against the impacts of some of these outbreaks. And then we'll continue to do awareness and then implementation of the SOPs. Next. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Martha, and I would like to thank Mr. Tumwesi Charles and Dr. Pantaleon Kasoma. They were very actively involved in organizing and formulating all this that we are sharing. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. George Owesije. I must say this has been a very enlightening presentation, and it's quite interesting to see some cross-cutting challenges, but some very sector-specific challenges. And I'm really hoping that with the discussion that we're going to have, for the next couple of minutes, we'll be able to interrogate further, what kind of strategies we can put in place. You've talked about collaboration. It's great that there's a lot of, sectoral collaboration so that we can mitigate the impact of COVID on conservation. Before I invite Dr. Kasoma, I'm going to request Mr. Charles Tumwesi, if you have anything to supplement on top of what Mr. George Owesije has presented. You have the floor, and I'll give you about 10 minutes. In the meantime, I'll request that if you have any questions, kindly type them in the chat box, and I'll try and round them up, and then we'll have a question and answer time before we can invite Dr. Kasoma. Thank you so much. Mr. Tumwesi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Martha. I actually don't think I need the 10 minutes since George Owesije has covered most of the issues. As he did mention, we provided information that he has presented. But I just wanted to highlight one thing, because when he was presenting the graphics, he did mention the increase in poaching in the months of April, May, and June, which we noticed compared to the previous year, 2019, when we didn't have COVID. Now, many people have been wondering what was the connection between COVID and increased poaching. From our analysis and from our intelligence, we noticed that those months were also the months when the lockdown was first announced in this country in late March, and then April, it started in April. In May, everything was under lockdown, and part of June, we were under the lockdown. Now, what we think could have happened is that, of course, the informal sector, which employs majority of the youth, was affected by the lockdown. And this forced many people into the villages, and many people who were used to getting money on a daily basis are now locked down. They can't have anything to eat. So some of these certainly resulted to going into poaching as a way of survival. And that partly contributed to the increase in poaching in those months. But two, most people, most of the communities also saw that UA was also under lockdown. So they saw that now that the lockdown has been announced, this is an opportunity for them to get in and get the resources that they have been denied. And they were later to realize that actually UA was not in the lockdown. That's why, again, when you look at the statistics of the suspects, and we were able to arrest quite a number because we were not in the lockdown. And over time, after June, we still have incidents of poaching, but comparable to the previous years. So we think that the spike that we saw in April, May, June has again leveled up to the normal poaching levels because people realized that we were not locked down and we were active. In fact, we have intensified onto the surveillance into the parks since we put off some of the activities and concentrated mainly on the wildlife protection. So I just wanted to emphasize that. And the rest, I think George has done a very good job. He has ably represented all the views that we had. So thank you, Masa, and all.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tumwesije. Maybe just to get the conversation going, I wanted to, my question to you, Mr. Owesije, is, what kind of advocacy is being done by Uganda Wildlife Authority to be able to have some sort of policy response when it comes to mitigating the impact of COVID on community conservation? I'm just eager to know, you talked about working with these different sectors, but maybe specifically, is there any targeted advocacy that you're doing as an entity, as a government entity?
Thank you, Martha. I hope I got you right. What are we doing? Well, we know that we cannot achieve the effective management of these resources on our own without partnering with others. So we are doing a lot of awareness, especially targeting communities that live adjacent to wildlife protected areas. On average, over 30 awareness meetings every week. And this is partly to raise awareness about the impact of, the benefits that could accrue from wildlife conservation, but also the impact of poaching and the potential opportunities for partnerships, but also for investment around these areas. So we've been working with communities, but also we've been on TV targeting the general public on the impacts of poaching, but also looking at how the private sector can partner with us to invest in management of what we call wildlife-based enterprises. So we've been trying to attract people and investors to breed, to trade, to invest in tourism. So the couple of things we are doing to address the challenges outlined earlier. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a question from Isaac. Maybe let me just read it. His question goes like this: which animals were targeted compared to others as a result of an increase in poaching? And the second part of his question is, was there an increase in the number of arrests of perpetrators? And if yes, where were the wildlife products destined to?
Yes, I will answer that. I was actually trying to type back to respond to Isaac, but for the benefit of all, I can respond as follows: that yes, the number, the poaching that we saw increasing is mainly subsistence poaching or bushmeat poaching, targeting mainly the antelopes for meat. Incidentally, we did not have many incidents of commercial poaching targeting trophies. Unfortunately, of course, when people set snares targeting the antelopes to get bush meat, the snares are non-discriminative. If a lion falls in, it will be caught. If a hyena gets into the snare, if an elephant gets into a snare. So the snares have impacts on all animals, although usually the target is usually the antelopes for meat. So the poaching that we saw spiking during this period is not the commercial trophy poaching that we had seen before. It was mainly bushmeat poaching that we saw increasing. And yes, the perpetrators were arrested, because if you saw the graph, the statistics which George presented, the number of arrests for 2020 are much higher than the arrests for 2019, especially during the months when we had COVID. And that shows that most of the perpetrators were actually arrested. So in terms of the trophies and the products destined for, as this was mainly targeting bushmeat, we didn't see a lot of trophies moving. But yes, the meat was sold. The meat is usually sold to the communities in markets, and yes, that's what I can say.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Tumwesije. I have another question from Charlotte. I will read it as well. George mentioned that over 50% of wildlife is outside protected areas. We know this wildlife is not under OA's remit, but what are OA's views on how this wildlife can be protected? And then the second part of her question is, how do we penalize or sensitize communities here and in other areas? We have heard of poaching and cutting of mature trees for charcoal. How do we stop this?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Charlotte, for the two questions. One is, I did say that an estimated 50% of our wildlife is outside protected areas. And I should clearly point out that this wildlife is, the protection and the management of this wildlife is, the mandate is for UWA. We have the obligation. And there are various interventions that have been implemented in the recent past, and we continue to implement more. But one of them is to establish, we've established what we call wildlife management stations, to targeting key wildlife areas outside protected areas. We have a wildlife management station in Chotel in Kakuto. That is a former Rakai, with our staff. So they're responsible for management of wildlife around that area. We have a wildlife management station around the Kagadi, Muhoro, and that is responsible for all that area. And then we have again, one in Agago. We have another wildlife management station in Changwanzi, because that area still has some significant populations of wildlife. We have one in Nakaseke. So that's how we have now distributed ourselves and spread out to ensure that, and we will continue to create more. We still work with the partners, private sector. We have about 5 concessionaires, that work with the districts and the communities to protect wildlife in areas around Kidepo, outside the park, Karenga area, around Piana Upe in Karamoja, around Lake Albert in the new district of Chikuwe. So, and in Karanga, we have also a company called the Lake Albert Safaris that works with us to protect animals, but also ensure that it's sustainable utilization and management. Now, so that's how we are trying. And now we have, as an institution, recently developed a national strategy for management of wildlife outside protected areas. So implementation of this strategy will see us expand more in some of the areas where we haven't been to. Initially, of course, you realize the mandate was huge, that we had to first concentrate on the protection of the protected areas, the national parks and reserves. But as we grew bigger and strengthened ourselves, now we are focusing also, we are bringing on board some of these areas. We are going to create wildlife management zones, eastern and northern, and we have our staff there. But already have. The second one is what do we do to penalize? What do we do to penalize people who are continuing to hunt and kill and illegally harvest resources? One is to arrest them. These are criminals. If you go to the Wildlife Act, they are criminals killing the animals illegally. So we needed to arrest them, and we, like I said, we work with the police, we work with the communities, we work with our staff, and even us as citizens, you find these people, you can help us to arrest them, apprehend them, take them to police, or notify the nearest Wildlife Authority station or police. Now, the other thing that be aware of is that the Wildlife Act was recently reviewed and enacted in Parliament, and the major outcome of that review was enhanced penalties. We have enhanced penalties for wildlife criminals, people who poach illegal, who kill the animals illegally. Now, the largest sentence or the heaviest is life imprisonment and 20 billion or both. So we have the law, and then she even talked about the plants. The forestry, the Ministry of Water and Environment is also reviewing the Forestry and Tree Planting Act of 2003, and one of the focus areas is to enhance. So we ensure that those who are captured, taken to court, they receive the heaviest sentence, and then we are able to move on. So surveillance, collaboration, awareness, all of these interventions will help us. And thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to take two more questions. The first one is from Charles, and it goes like this. How can primate tourism be achieved successfully now that standard operating procedures are key for both visitors, park staff, and primates? Perhaps
if I can take that on, and then maybe somebody else can supplement. I need to add that yes, tourism has reopened. We've already developed standard operating procedures. In addition to the Ministry of Health standard operating procedures for COVID, we've also developed specific SOPs for the tourism sector. But even prior to that, under the auspices of the Greater Virunga Transboundary Collaboration, the partners that work within the ape tourism region of Bwindi, Mugahinga, and the Virungas already came together and came up with other standard operating procedures. Now, these ones revised some of the most of the common ape tourism guidelines that we knew. For example, we knew that when you are tracking gorillas, you should stay a minimum of 7 meters. Now we've revised that to 10 meters. But the other thing that we had been tinkering with over time, but now we are able to implement, is the use of masks. Previously, we were discussing whether people going to see EPs should wear masks or not. We were before COVID, and it was a huge debate, but now it is no longer a debate. It's now a must that people must wear masks. And we are also emphasizing testing of the people that interact with gorillas. We've already done, I think, a round of testing of all our staff, the tourism police, the porters, the UPDF, and the communities that are neighboring some of these hotspot tourism areas have been tested, and we are working with partners, of course, to manage the results and ensure that if people are found positive, they are helped to isolate, but also to get treatment. So yes, tourism is it is possible to do EP tourism with strict implementation of the standard operating procedures. And we already have additional standard operating procedures that have been developed for tourism, but also for EP tourism that we will continue to implement. But somebody else could add on.
Any more additions? I have one last question. I'm trying to manage.
Maybe I can add something.
Okay.
That working with partners around some of these protected areas, we continue to ensure that the health of the communities is also kept under constant surveillance. We have the conservation through public health that looks at the communities, takes samples, and then they're able to know how the communities are faring in terms of their health performance. And we have, again, colleagues, researchers at Chiwale that also continue to collect samples from both the animals and communities and look at the interface and if there are any outbreaks that we could detect early enough. Thank you.
Thank you for that addition, Mr. Owesigye. The last question before I invite Dr. Panta Kasoma, as this is from Julius, as tourism is slowly catching up, what is OWA doing to help the porters with the standard operating procedures, since these are the people that are directly involved with the tourists during mountain gorilla tracking? And I think you had mentioned, you had started answering that in your previous response, Mr. Tumwesige. But maybe if there is any addition.
Yes, just add that we've already had a round of trainings for all the stakeholders that are involved in gorilla tourism around Bwindi, and this includes park staff, the porters, the researchers, and some of the conservation organizations working around Bwindi. We've already done a training on how to really work together in this time to ensure that both the gorillas and also the humans are safe from COVID. And I think it is very helpful when you work with partners. What you think is a bit difficult becomes much easier. So we are seeing good cooperation and collaboration, and we shall continue to work with our partners to ensure that both the humans and the animals are safe by implementing the standard operating procedures. But we are also working again with governments to ensure that the communities get masks. There are other standard operating procedures. Anybody going has to sanitize and all that social distancing. So we think that it is possible, and the porters are part and parcel of the tourism chain for the gorillas. So we are working with them.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Tumwesige. Thank you. I think because we don't have any more questions, we shall round up this question and answer time. In these last 15 minutes, I'm going to request Dr. Kasoma to give his closing remarks. But before that, I would like to also say thank you, because I've seen very many people are trying to drop off, probably because they have other engagements. So I would like to say a very big thank you on behalf of my mother, my brother, my sister-in-law, who are all within the meeting right now, and they're listening in. We appreciate that you could honor us and honor our father with this webinar. And thank you again to Mr. Tumwesije and Mr. Wesije. Dr. Kasoma, you have the floor.
Thank you, Martha. At the time technology failed me, you had asked me to give a few remarks by way of opening. I'll just use this time to, just briefly mention a few things. Way back in 1973, when I joined Makerere, we were introduced to the staff, and at that time there were a lot of Europeans, South Africans, but among the young emerging Africans or Ugandans, I was Dr. and then Mr. Eldad Tukahirwa, who was a special assistant. And then he went on to finish his master's, became a lecturer, eventually, got a scholarship and went and did his PhD. I should mention that around 73, 74, most of the expatriate staff actually departed. And so it was upon the remaining few young Ugandans to keep the institution going. And these responsibilities were placed on the likes of Dr. Tukahirwa at that time, and the late, James Gwahaba, and many others, Dr. Longino Gwa. So when we went in, those were the people on the staff. And then later, when we completed, I was fortunate to do well and go back and join them as a special assistant, and then also worked my way up until they became my colleagues, and we became very good colleagues with Eldad, and eventually, of course, things were not easy at Makerere at that time. People were looking at opportunities and how they could look after their families. An opportunity came up for him, and he joined IUCN, first at the Uganda office, and then later becoming regional director. So much as he, by training, had been an entomologist, he, over the years, developed a broader interest in the animals and wildlife and the issues of environment. And of course, not many people think about insects when we talk about wildlife here, but it is a huge component of wildlife. In fact, it's the largest component, which we tend to ignore, and yet it's very vital. So at the time, of course, of his, at the time he left us, he was still a very key conservation, conscious person. He was very keen on conservation of wildlife in our protected areas and elsewhere. And so I wish to thank you, Martha, and and your mom for having kept this legacy of Eldad by organizing these events. This one happens to be virtual, but there have been a few others which where people interacted and discussed various issues. But I'm glad that even despite the COVID challenge, you've been able to put this together so that we can keep his legacy going. Now, to turn to the discussion of today, I just would like to say that George and Charles have done a very good job in that they've highlighted all the challenges. Now, sitting in my position as the current chair of the board, it shows you how difficult things have become. just until last year, UWA was a vibrant organization with lots of resources at its disposal. We had huge plans actually for things that would be following. We were thinking of helicopters, we were thinking of drones, we were thinking of all sorts of things, most of which have now been put on hold because of the impact of COVID. He gave you the statistics, and you can see that things are really not bad. Be that as it may, we still have wildlife, we still have protected areas, and we still have a responsibility to continue looking after that legacy, Uganda's legacy. And the board, that's the reason it's called the Board of Trustees, is because we are not like a normal board of directors. We are trustees. We are entrusted with looking after Uganda's wildlife heritage, looking after it, not as ours, not as the only shareholders, but as Uganda's heritage. So there is a challenge here in that wildlife is still viewed as something that belongs to Uganda Wildlife Authority, which is wrong, really. And part of the blame, of course, might go to Uganda Wildlife Authority itself, but the general population of Uganda itself, I think we need to internalize the fact that this wildlife is for Ugandans, and that as Ugandans, we have a responsibility to look after it, because the benefits cannot be overemphasized. It's already been stated that at some point tourism was really the biggest foreign exchange earner for this country, and most of the tourism to Uganda is actually dependent on wildlife. People come here to see gorillas, people come here to see chimpanzees, people come here to see elephants and things like that. Increasingly, of course, there are certain people who would like to see other things. It's just that we've not given them the opportunity. Now, those are the things we're thinking about. There are people who are fanatical about butterflies. There are people who are fanatical about bats, let alone birds. So those are things that we've really not explored because we've been concentrating a lot on the large mammals. And I think it is high time, resources permitting, that we need to diversify, as was pointed out, to look at other options. Because Uganda has a lot to offer, which is often overlooked. People will say, oh, I want to go to Uganda to see gorillas. And then the general impression will be that maybe that is the only thing there is to see here. And yet, there are many other things that could be seen. Now, it is incumbent upon us as Ugandans to try and highlight what these other attractions are. Now, law enforcement, community conservation. These two are closely related. On one hand, we have law enforcement. On the other, we have what you call the carrot approach. The fact that this wildlife belongs to all of us actually should give us the courage to get communities to take more responsibility for this wildlife. And I think one of the major reasons why we have this rope pulling between the community and the authority is because of the perception that was wildlife. So this is one challenge that UWA has got to address at some point, so that we get to a point where people begin to see wildlife as a resource that they benefit from. This has happened in the Bwindi area, for example, over the last 2 decades or so, because of the benefits that have accrued from gorilla tourism to the communities around Bwindi. So you now find that Unlike in the past, you just cannot go into Bwindi and do whatever you want. People will get concerned because they know, you're going to harm our gorillas. They are now our gorillas. Unlike in the past, where they were first government gorillas, national parks gorillas, Uganda Wildlife gorillas, they are our gorillas now. So I think we need to translate that kind of thing more widely, even to other protected areas, so that people begin to see that these are resources. Of course, there are many other things one could talk about, which we do not have enough time for. But I wanted also to talk about one thing. Somebody raised the issue of primate tourism. Yeah, primate tourism is a sensitive area. Primates are closely related to us. They could easily get affected by COVID-19. And that is why we are being extremely careful with this SOPs when we are implementing the new or the renewed primate tourism. So, Martha, I wish I could go on, but I can see my clock is ticking away. But I thought that I would thank the two, Charles and George, for highlighting some of these issues. And perhaps now that we've seen that this could be something that is workable, we could have more of these in future. I guess given enough lead time, we would have had much more, many more participants than we've had, because there's been a very short period of time in which to mobilize participation. But I hope that in future we'll get enough time. And there's so many issues we'd like to hear from the public also, what ideas they have, which could feed into, UA's own, activities. Because as somebody said, these things are not unique. I mean, they are not, one cannot claim to have all the knowledge. So maybe by engaging the general populace, we could get some ideas that would definitely help in seeing how we address human-wildlife conflict, seeing how we address the issue of community benefits, and seeing how we address the issue of ownership. There is this issue of the policy and the law, allows people to be able to use wildlife in a various ways, but many people don't know. So maybe we need also to get that one out so that people know that I can actually legally be able to benefit from wildlife. Again, that's something that needs to be done. But again, we are just hoping and praying that COVID at some point will disappear and that we'll begin to see a vibrancy that we've been previously seeing. So I thank you very much for organizing this and wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kasoma. It's always great to tap into your wealth of expertise, your wisdom, and it's also great to, it makes, for us family members who are on the call, it's very nostalgic listening to you because you sound very much.
Regards to everybody, Simon and company.
And his wife, yes, Simon and Daphne are on call as well.
Okay.
Yeah, but I really would like to say thank you to yourself, to George, to Charles. I think there are very many key takeaways for me, but I think if we acknowledge that we have a shared responsibility, then that way we can, co-create strategies in which we can, we can keep pushing for conservation within Uganda, but also across the borders. I really want to end at 4:30 on the dot. Thank you all very much. What I'm going to do, this session has been recorded. I started recording, I think, about 10 minutes in. So I will upload it onto YouTube and share it as a link to all of you participants, since you all registered, and therefore I have your email addresses. Thank you very much. And on behalf of the Tukahirwa family, we appreciate your participation, and we hope that we'll be able to interact in the very near future. Please stay safe and have a very Merry Christmas. Goodbye.
Thank you, Martha. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Merry Christmas too.